Supporting bird welfare through the power of probiotics. That is the topic I'm going to discuss with Kay Russo. She is Poultry Technical Services Manager at Christian Hansen, part of Novonesis, a global, differentiated bioscience company that develops natural ingredient solutions for the food, nutritional, pharmaceutical, and agricultural industries. My name is Iris Hofman, and I'm editor for Poultry World. Welcome, Kai. It's a pleasure to have this interview with you. To dive right in, why is welfare important and what are the major welfare issues in the poultry industry?
Well, first, thank you for having me today. I'm glad to be here. So, I've been a veterinarian for almost 14 years now, and I've worked in different capacities, both as a clinician in the field as well as in industry. And given the nature of intensive production systems, there are inherent welfare issues that arise. And whether you're a vet or an animal caregiver, a producer, or really anyone responsible for the day in and day out care of these animals, it's important that they're treated with optimal care and respect. And so the end consumer is also growing increasingly aware and concerned about how these animals are treated, both at the farm level as well as the processing level. So ultimately, we have an ethical obligation to ensure that the animals are well cared for, both from a physical but also a mental perspective. And so when we take a step back and look at the various welfare issues that the poultry industry faces, we think about issues such as feather pecking and fighting, lameness, particularly infectious as well as non-infectious. And the genetic companies have done a nice job to essentially try to breed out some of the genetic components to this, but we still do combat a fair degree of infectious lameness in the field. Other items would include piling, so smothering when we go to work with birds, whether it's to vaccinate them or move them or to put them on the truck to send to slaughter. As they get stressed, they can pile on top of one another, and this leads to mortalities. Then we have transport and handling stress, whether it's between sites or to slaughter. Thermal stress, particularly in the summertime when we have high heat and humidity, as well as air quality issues. So if we look at the air quality in barns, we combat issues with ammonia, which can have health implications, as well as high dust levels, which has implications for the health of the birds as well as the workers. Other issues would include osteoporosis and fractures, particularly in layer hens. And then the ability to express normal behaviors, which relates back to essentially how we house the birds. As we look across the United States, we're seeing increased legislation with respect to the amount of space a bird needs to have, as well as certain cage-free requirements, for instance. And this truly relates back to the ability of those birds to express normal behaviors. Diseases, obviously, are major welfare issues, and this is something I'm intimately familiar with as a veterinarian, unfortunately. And then finally, handling at slaughter. So essentially what happens to the birds after they leave the farm? How are they handled? How are they essentially stored on the truck prior to slaughter? And how are they handled as they enter into the plant? And so I know that's a long-winded answer, but essentially those are what pop into my mind as the major welfare issues that our industry faces.
Yeah, a lot of things to think about, a lot of factors that can influence the
Absolutely.
welfare, of course. So you work for Christian Hansen, of course. What kind of role do they want to play, and how important is that welfare for this company?
Sure, absolutely. So Christian Hansen actually is now known as Novonesis.
Yeah.
So I'll just state that off the bat. But traditionally, as a Christian Hansen employee, and as I move into being employee at Novonesis, and really any company that provides products in direct support of animal agriculture and production animal agriculture, I should say, should have welfare as a major consideration. So Christian Hansen, or now Novonesis, employs individuals such as myself and my colleagues that provide field support daily to producers, to vets, to folks that work with the animals daily, to nutritionists, to help address some of these issues that relate back to welfare. And so, although it might seem like a bit of a stretch to think that a company that markets probiotics, for instance, would have interest or impact on animal welfare, these items are part of my role as a technical services vet and as I work in the field with our customers. And if we were to actually take the question and consider it more granularly, there's actually an increasing body of evidence that what we consume, whether it's you, Iris, or me, or animals in production, agriculture, what we consume can have a direct impact on the microbe composition of our gut. And that in turn can turn around and have an impact on the central nervous system or the brain. And that happens through a number of different parallel communicating channels. So there's just an increased body of evidence that this is all interconnected.
Exactly. And if you're talking about a gut-brain connection, how does that impact the welfare?
Yeah, so that's exactly what I'm referring to. The common catchphrase, what you'll see in modern news, is essentially the gut brain microbiome axis. And ultimately, to explain it as simply as I can, there are bidirectional interactions that occur between the gut, the brain, and the microbes that are present within the animal. And so the gut microbe communicates through at least three different channels, including the nerves, the endocrine system, which is essentially the hormones, and immune signaling mechanisms. And then the brain can then turn around and communicate with the gut through essentially modulating the activity of the gut. And if anyone's ever been truly frightened, they're aware of this connection, right? If you get scared, then this has impacts on the motility of your gut. And so the brain can also alter intestinal secretion of certain hormones and impact the leakiness of the gut. So allowing, for instance, certain pathogens to get across in states of dysregulation. So what we're seeing is sort of this loop, and the gut interacts with the brain interacts with the gut, and this all impacts what microbes are present. And so if we are to damage this loop, it's referred to as dysregulation. And this can have an impact on the microbiome, and inevitably it can impact the central nervous system or the brain negatively. So, for instance, if there's a stressor imposed on the animal, this can in turn impact the community structure and function of the gut, potentially leading to disease. And it's all very interconnected. And so I'm going to give an example because I know we're getting a bit in the weeds. So when I first started my career, I was a dairy veterinarian. So forgive me, this is going to be a dairy example, but I find it's a nice illustration of this point. So in dairy calves, there's an issue called clostridial bloat. And it can be a fairly common occurrence and a very serious condition that can arise in groups of calves. And it's caused by a particular pathogen called Clostridium perfringens. And perfringens is, as a clinician, I should back up, as a clinician, I would often see these sort of outbreaks of clostridial bloat. And they were followed shortly after some sort of stressful event. So, for instance, really poor weather, a very high heat for a couple days in a row, or say a severe snowstorm. And I couldn't quite understand why this was occurring. But now that I've been in the industry for a little bit and I've read through some of the previous research, there's work to support the fact that when an animal gets stressed, they release hormones, right? And those are called catecholamines or stress hormones. And these hormones can have a direct impact on increasing growth rates of certain pathogens like Clostridium. So it's really not a far stretch to think that when an animal's exposed to stressful events, i.e. bad weather, the increase of the stress hormones in that animal can in fact impact the growth rate of certain pathogens like Clostridium in the gut and ultimately lead to disease. So I think that's just a nice example of how this connection works, and dysregulation of this connection can ultimately lead to disease in an animal.
Exactly. And what do you see in the researchers if we're looking at the poultry sector?
If we look at basically the body of evidence that is growing here, ultimately what we're finding is that birds that are stressed or in certain disease states can have an alteration in certain hormones, for instance. And this may, in fact, be directly related back to certain populations of bacteria in the gut. And so we have seen evidence that birds, for instance, that have certain populations of bacteria in the gut can in fact have higher levels of circulating serotonin, for instance, or this hormone of well-being, whereas birds that do not have those populations have lower levels of this hormone. So that's just one example of what we see in poultry.
Exactly. And why should we care about the probiotic welfare connection?
So, whether we're discussing a production animal or a human, this body of evidence is also suggestive of the fact that what we consume can have a direct impact on those microbes. So, as I previously mentioned, damage to this gut brain microbe loop can have negative impacts on the animal. Which I would also argue that if we support this loop through the use of certain effective in feed technologies, such as a probiotic, then we can in fact optimize its functionality or at least maintain the state of normal in the face of stressful events.
Are there any more results worth mentioning now?
Yeah, I mean, ultimately, we've continued to explore this space and in previous studies and in future studies, looking at the impact of probiotics on very visible welfare issues. And one of those that I mentioned previously was lameness, for instance. Infectious lameness is a major issue in the broiler industry, the broiler breeder industry. And so, in a previous study conducted by Christian Hansen, the impact of a probiotic was assessed in a lameness model meant to emulate a particular condition called bacterial osteomyelitis chondronecrosis. So definitely a mouthful. So ultimately, we typically refer to it as BCO. And in this study, the birds were challenged with a pathogen called Staphylococcus. And the birds that received the effective probiotic in this study had significantly lower levels of cumulative lameness as compared to the control birds. And so we continue to evaluate products that are relevant to this issue, particularly in broilers, for instance. So hopefully, as these studies come out of the pipeline, we will be able to present some of that data. And then ultimately, as a company, we have a huge body of data in multiple different species that essentially demonstrates that the use of an effective probiotic can have direct impacts on digestion, nutrient absorption, so optimizing nutrient absorption from the diet, barrier function, so looking at the intestinal barrier as a way of keeping pathogens out, right? And then finally, immune functionality. And so, if you remember nothing else from this interview, without a doubt, in my mind, every animal, every human, every child, every day should receive the benefit of an effective probiotic.
Absolutely. Well, thank you very much for your insights, and I'm looking forward to see more of this.